So my grandparents, Roy and Thelma Bitzer, lived in a house in Dover in the woods. The house was built by my grandfather and his father with their own 4 hands. My grandfather was a graphic arts teacher, and my grandmother was a librarian turned professional storyteller in her retirement. And so that naturally contributed to the way that we were raised. Our childhoods were full of imagination. My brother and I were the oldest of several cousins, and luckily that meant that we got to really get to know our grandparents before their minds and bodies got the best of them. And so every year in October, they hosted the annual Bitzer Halloween party. And this party consisted of first a bonfire on one side of the property that started with a storytelling, and then a second bonfire on the other end of the property by way of a very scary haunted trail in between. So every year, we gathered around the bonfire on one end. My grandmother, the storyteller, would tell spooky tales. Someone in the distance would pop in Scary Sounds Volume 1 on cassette and hit play on the boombox, and so it would begin. So when we were thoroughly spooked, my grandmother gathered the group and we would start to walk through the haunted trail. So first it started off at Spider Alley, a couple spider webs here and there. Then we would pass the haunted graveyard, which was really just where my grandparents would bury every cat and dog that would die. But it was very scary. And then eventually we would pass Ghost Alley, where my grandmother had taken a couple scraps of bed sheets and hung them in the trees. So as kids, this was pretty terrifying. If we saw it, we believed it. But eventually we ended up at the second bonfire on the other end of the property, where we calmed our nerves over toasting marshmallows and hot dogs on the open flame, and the rest of the evening was spent with our loved ones, sipping cider, bobbing for apples, and enjoying the best of fall. So this went on for years, where our grandparents' quiet house in the woods would suddenly turn into this magical, mischievous land full of terror and mischief. We were little, and what we saw right in front of our eyes was as true as what our grandparents were presenting to us. But then after a while, my brother and I started to grow a little bit older, and this Halloween party and this haunted trail sort of started to seem a little bit funny. The mummy that would run by us in the woods was wearing the same jeans that I'm pretty sure my Aunt Sally was wearing earlier in the day. And the mummy that jumped out at us looked an awful lot like my Uncle Scott from behind. And so we started to ask questions, and my family knew the ruse was up. But that didn't mean that the fun stopped, not at all. In fact, this was a grand sort of changing of guards. My brother and I were the scared, and now we were the scary. And so we thought, we were almost teenagers at this point, so we thought, well, everything that our parents have done thus far is completely lame. And it was time to make an even scarier, bigger, even harder, badder haunted trail to terrify our younger cousins. So my brother, the Quentin Tarantino of the group, orchestrated these elaborate ruses that would just, make our cousins pee their pants. We and our friends rigged all these things, but there was one thing we didn't change. We still kept that cassette of Scary Sounds Volume 1 blaring as loud as we could. So it started with story time on the one end of the property. We told the scariest tales we could think of, the ones that were the latest ones in middle school that year, ones that would make our moms sweat. And then we designed an elaborate trail, a spider kingdom that you literally had to crawl through to get out. We had men with chainsaws that made real-life child abductions from the crowd. We had witches that had escaped from insane asylums with blood all over their face. This was next-level shit, okay? And then eventually, we ended at the second bonfire, and all was well again. But, the years went on. Our younger cousins grew older, as did we. Our grandparents eventually grew old and passed. And so that was the end of the annual Bitzer Halloween party. But I think what this reflects is all throughout life, we have these different ruses that sort of play on our naivety. And as we figure out what's really behind the scenes, or we think that we know what the trick is all about, we gain this sense of pride that now we know better, or we're older and we're wiser. But I think with that pride really comes a longing, and it comes a longing that we long for those days where what we see is what we can believe. And the vivid color of life is right in front of our eyes, and we can take it for what we see. But I think also what we realize is that as adults, sometimes you just got to pop in those scary sounds volume 1 and just let go.